Miss Marple and the Stranger at the Vicar's Gate. Chapter 1. The visitor in Blewett was a bright morning in the village of Lydney St. Mary, one of those early spring days that seemed stitched together with birdsong and the gentle hum of bees waking from winter. The church bell had just chimed 9 when Mrs. Bantry, always early for her Tuesday errands, paused at the greengrocer's to discuss the price of gooseberries and the scandal of Mrs. Finch's new lawn ornament. At the same time, a stranger arrived at the vicarage. He was tall, thin as a post, and dressed in a well-cut but curiously outdated blue suit. His shoes, despite the dust of travel, gleamed with the polish of someone meticulous about appearances. The Reverend Lionel Upwater was just tying the final knot in his bean trellis when the man appeared at the garden gate. "Good morning," the stranger said with the faintest trace of an accent. "European, perhaps. I wonder if I might trouble you for a moment." The vicar, startled but courteous, lowered his trowel. "Of course. Always time for a visitor. Are you lost?" The man smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "No, not lost. Only looking for a quiet place to rest. I've walked from the station." Reverend Upwater, who prided himself on Christian charity even more than his ability to quote obscure 17th-century sermons, offered tea without hesitation. The man accepted, though he declined biscuits. Within the hour, the stranger had vanished. Left no name, no note, and no trace. By the time Miss Marple heard about the encounter, over tea and ginger cake at Mrs. Price Ridley's that very afternoon, the story had changed 3 times. "Some sort of foreign gentleman," Mrs. Price Ridley declared, slicing her cake with military precision. "Or perhaps an agent of the government. You know how they pop in and out, never leaving a forwarding address." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "He wore blue, you say?" "Indeed, and vanished within minutes. You know, Jane, if you'll pardon the observation, such people are rarely up to any good." At that precise moment, the church bell rang again, once for each solemn toll, then silence. By sundown, Constable Reeves was combing the edge of the vicarage garden, for beneath the hedgerow, behind a cluster of half-pruned holly, lay the body of a man. He had not walked away after all. His head was turned awkwardly toward the earth, one gloved hand curled as if grasping at something in his final moment. The other hand was bare, revealing a curious scar beneath the thumb, a jagged lightning shape. By dusk, the constable had roped off the garden with string. The vicar's wife had fainted twice, and 3 villagers had already claimed to recognize the man, though none could agree on his name. Miss Marple, knitting in the window of her rose-covered cottage, paused with a half-formed pearl. "Murder," she thought with a sigh, "and in the vicarage, of all places." Not 2 hours later, a sergeant from Much Biddleton arrived to take charge, and already the rumours were growing like dandelions. Espionage, blackmail, a secret lover from the past. But Miss Marple, folding her hands over her knitting needles, thought not of international intrigue nor youthful passions. She thought of the peculiar detail Mrs. Price Ridley had so casually mentioned. The visitor had declined biscuits, and no Englishman in his right mind did that, especially not on a country walk. She tapped her finger once on the wooden armrest, a soft sound lost beneath the whisper of twilight. something was most certainly wrong, and someone she suspected was telling lies. Chapter 2. Gossip over gooseberries. The next morning, the village of Lydney St. Mary woke with a collective start, as though the very hedgerows had whispered the news into every cottage window before sunrise. The stranger had been murdered, and not just murdered, but within the quiet borders of the vicarage garden, a spot that had hitherto only known the drama of the bishop's lost sermon notes and a rather aggressive mole infestation. At Mrs. Bartlett's shop, the murmurs began, before the milk delivery had even arrived. "I told you," hissed Mrs. Simpkins to her friend Dora Lugg. "He looked like trouble from the start. Men who arrive unannounced always are. Remember the travelling wallpaper salesman in 46? Dora nodded gravely. Still, to be stabbed like that, do you think the vicar saw it? Heavens no. Reverend Upwater is practically blind without his glasses, and Edith says he was down by the potting shed all morning." Across the lane at the butcher's, Mr. Cooper was offering a quite different theory. "I say he was after something, not just here by chance. He asked about the church, when he came in Monday, you know. Asked who lived in which house. Unnatural curiosity, if you ask me." By the time the chatter reached the tea-room, the stranger had been everything from a foreign spy to a jilted lover of Miss Weatherby, who had not had a suitor since 1932, and was still blissfully unaware of the entire affair. Only one person sat quietly amid the buzz of speculation. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking gently over her lap, sipped her tea and watched the room, not rudely, not intrusively, but with the attentive serenity of someone who had seen many things in her long life and missed very little. She did not speak of murder, not yet. Instead, she focused on the incongruities, the little human inconsistencies that fluttered around conversations like unseen midges, the kind most people swatted away. She had already noted that Reverend Upwater's story, as relayed by his wife to the grocer's wife to the fishmonger's cousin, had changed twice by breakfast. Initially, he'd claimed the man asked for tea, then later that he'd simply asked directions and left immediately. The omission might have been innocent, shock-muddled details after all, but it was worth remembering. More curious was the account of young Leonard Reed, the vicar's assistant, and a boy of barely 19, with a sullen mouth and too much brill cream in his hair. According to him, the visitor never entered the house at all. "But that can't be right," murmured Miss Marple aloud, causing her companion, Mrs. Hartnell, to look up from her scone. "Oh, nothing, dear," said Miss Marple with a smile. "Only wool gathering. You know how these things unsettle one." Mrs. Hartnell, already 3 theories deep about a secret love-child of the bishop's, hardly noticed. At midday, Constable Reeves came knocking at Miss Marple's door. He looked harried, as if he'd been asked to alphabetize every gravestone in the parish. "Thought you'd want to know, Miss Marple," he said, rubbing his hat between his fingers. "The man had no identification on him. Not a stitch. Clothes, tailored abroad, nothing British made. And the scar on his hand? Military, we think, but foreign. Could be German or Yugoslavian. No papers, no luggage, no label in his coat." Miss Marple gave a quiet nod. "And no one in the village recognized him." The constable hesitated. Mrs. Lumley says she saw someone just like him 2 months ago at the train station in Market Hale. But she also thinks the milkman's a reincarnated monk, so— Quite, Miss Marple said, eyes twinkling. Reeves exhaled. I'll be honest, we've got nothing to go on, and the Chief Inspector from Biddleton is arriving this evening. He'll want something more than village gossip. Gossip, said Miss Marple softly, can be surprisingly revealing, Constable, especially when it contradicts itself. She thanked him for the visit and returned to her parlour window. From there she could see the vicar's gate, still, watched by a policeman with a clipboard and a growing look of boredom. The holly bush where the body had been found was partially trimmed, as if the murder itself had interrupted someone's gardening. Miss Marple's fingers returned to her knitting, but her mind was not on yarn. It was on the peculiar absence of motive. Most village murders, rare as they were, had something emotional at the heart of them. Love, betrayal, greed, even revenge. But this man had no known ties to anyone in Lydney St. Mary. He'd not argued with anyone, stolen anything, or even overstayed his welcome. By most accounts, he had spoken fewer than 50 words. And yet, someone had killed him violently. She leaned back in her chair and watched the vicarage. A pair of crows settled on the chimney, cawing noisily. In a village where everyone knew everything, this man was a stranger, and Miss Marple found it very hard to believe he had come there by chance. Chapter 3. The Man with No Luggage. By Thursday morning, Lydney St. Mary had settled into a curious rhythm. Half real village, half theatre stage. People strolled past the vicarage under the pretence of fresh air, but with eyes sharp as hawks, and a great many errands now required detours past the garden gate. Conversations leaned slightly too loud near shop doors and village greens, as if the correct theory, said with enough conviction, might become truth. Inside the vicarage, Reverend Upwater sat at his desk, pale and tight-lipped, making a clumsy effort at his Sunday sermon. Every few lines he struck through his writing and began again. Edith, his wife, stood by the window-sill, polishing a spot that had been polished 3 times already that morning. "I can't bear this, Lionel," she said abruptly, breaking the uneasy quiet. "Reporters sniffing around. That awful inspector questioning me twice about whether the man drank his tea. What does it matter if he drank it or not? He was murdered, Lionel." The vicar looked up, flinching slightly. "It matters, my dear, because it is all they have. There is no name, no belongings, no background. We offered the man hospitality, and he died under our holly bush." Edith turned from the window. "But why here? Why our garden? We've never harmed a soul." Reverend Upwater didn't reply. Outside, the gate clicked gently in the wind. That same morning, Miss Marple made her customary call to the library. Her visits had never been known to deviate, and Miss Brimsley, the librarian, always had her week's fiction ready. This time, however, Miss Marple lingered beside the local history section, fingers running absently across the dust jackets. "Did you know," she said conversationally, "that the vicarage was once part of the manor estate?" Miss Brimsley blinked. "Oh, yes, belonged to the Hargraves. Long before the war, of course. Sold it in pieces when the 3rd Viscount gambled himself into ruin." "Curious how quickly people forget," Miss Marple said with a smile. "But houses remember." As she turned to leave, a boy of perhaps 11 ran past the window outside. He wore a school cap far too big for his head and carried a paper-wrapped parcel. A moment later, Miss Marple saw him again, this time sprinting. Toward the post office, the parcel missing. She paused, then stepped outside. "Timothy Cartwright," she called gently. The boy skidded to a halt. "Yes, Miss Marple." "That parcel you had, where did it go?" "Mr. Reed took it, miss. Said it was for the police. He was coming from the vicarage and told me I'd best not tell anyone I saw it, but I figured you'd ask." Miss Marple thanked him and returned to her cottage, the gears in her mind turning faster now. Leonard Reed, the young assistant, sullen, evasive, and now sneaking off with a package he hadn't mentioned to the constable or the sergeant. By tea-time, the chief inspector from Much Biddleton had arrived. Inspector Bullfinch was large, florid, and deeply suspicious of village interference. He brought with him a briefcase, a tight schedule, and an unfortunate tendency to insult by implication. "I have it on good authority," he said, pausing to sip tepid coffee in the vicarage parlour, "that this was likely a transient, perhaps a thief casing the place. Wrong house, wrong time, a crime of opportunity." Miss Marple, who had arrived with fresh scones as a show of kindness to the Reverend's wife, sat quietly beside the ficus plant. "Very possible," she murmured, "although I've often noticed that opportunity seldom knocks on strangers' behalf, and rarely while wearing polished shoes." Bullfinch gave her a thin smile. "Quite." She did not press the point. Instead, she asked mildly, "Has the man's coat been examined? The lining, perhaps?" The inspector frowned. "Of course, it was expensive. No maker's label, though. No initials. Tailored, yes, but likely second-hand. These foreigners often purchase off the rack abroad." Miss Marple nodded and began to pack up her basket. Just before leaving, she turned to Edith Upwater. "My dear, forgive the imposition, but might I have a look at your guest room?" Edith blinked. Well, it hasn't been used since Lionel's cousin visited. But of course, if you wish." The room was small and immaculate. One white-paned window, a modest bed, a writing desk. The sheets had been changed recently. Monsieur Marple ran a hand gently along the window-sill, then knelt beside the small waste-bin. Nothing unusual. Tissue, a torn receipt, and a small silver twist of paper, no larger than a fingernail. She held it up, inspecting it. Chocolate wrapper. Belgian. And suddenly she remembered something. Not long ago, at the Easter fete, she had overheard Mrs. Bartlett talking about a man who asked whether the village shop sold Belgian chocolates, specifically cigarette sticks with the orange sugar. Nobody in Lydney St. Mary ate those. They were practically unknown outside of the continent. Miss Marple stood. "Thank you, Edith. I do believe I shall return tomorrow." As she walked home, the wind picked up. The church bell rang softly in the distance, echoing through the dusk. She passed the vicarage gate, still watched, still silent, and noted a small smear on the post. Mud, likely, but oddly placed. Too high to be from boots, too low for a shoulder. It told her something. Not everything, not yet, but something. The man had not come from the road, he had come from the side. And Miss Marple, whose memory was as sharp as her sewing scissors, suddenly recalled a back path once used by delivery boys long before the war, now overgrown, but still there. Away in unseen. Chapter 4 Whispers in the vicarage garden. By Friday morning, the unease in Lydney St. Mary had sunk deeper than village gossip. What had begun as murmured speculation now took the shape of quiet glances exchanged in church pews, incomplete sentences over scones, and a sudden interest in who did or did not lock their garden gates. The weather, as if in sympathy, had grown damp and grey. Miss Marple, however, remained steady. She had spent the evening prior reviewing an old parish map, a gift from Mr. Clement, the previous vicar, who had once described it as more accurate than the census. Her memory of the overgrown footpath at the side of the vicarage had been confirmed. It was marked faintly, Service Path, discontinued 1939. The next morning, she returned to the vicarage under the guise of delivering a jar of quince jelly. Edith Upwater, frailer than before and grateful for company, ushered her inside, without hesitation. "Everyone thinks we should leave," Edith confessed, lowering her voice as she set the tea tray down. "Even the bishop called. Well-meaning, of course, but it's obvious he believes something unsavoury must have drawn the man here." Miss Marple's knitting needles remained still in her lap. "And what do you believe, my dear?" Edith hesitated. "I believe someone wanted him found here, that he didn't choose the vicarage for any ordinary reason. He was left here, perhaps, after the fact." It was a shrewd thought, one Miss Marple had considered herself. She leaned in slightly, her tone casual. "Do you know if Leonard Reed has been staying on the grounds?" Edith's face pinched. "Only in the old gardener's cottage. We let him use it while he applies to theological college, but he's been strange lately, snappish. And I caught him coming in through the kitchen door late last night. Said he was looking for his pocketbook, but I know he'd already fetched it earlier." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her mind tucked the detail away. "I wonder," she said gently, "whether it would be possible to walk through the garden." Edith blinked. "The garden? Just for air," Miss Marple said with a kindly smile. "I find gardens often calm the nerves." Within minutes she was outside again, accompanied by the soft brush of wind in the hedges and the heavy scent of sodden soil. A constable stood dutifully by the holly bush, his notebook balanced on one hand like a tray. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said with a slight nod. "Nothing new, I'm afraid." "Quite all right," she replied, crouching beside the bush. "Though may I ask, was the body facing toward the house or away?" The constable glanced at his notes. "Toward, miss, like he'd been turning back, or maybe trying to crawl." She nodded, her gaze moving beyond the bush, towards the overgrown path she remembered. With deliberate slowness, she took a few careful steps through the thicket, following the faint trace of trampled grass. It was still there, narrow but walkable. The old path twisted around the side of the vicarage toward a crumbling brick wall that had once marked the estate's rear boundary. And just before the break in the wall, she found it, a torn button, black, matte-finished, slightly scuffed on the edge. Not old, but not new either. She did not touch it with her fingers, but used the edge of a handkerchief to lift it gently. She did not need to take it to the inspector. She already knew where it had come from. Leonard Reed's overcoat. She had seen the missing button 2 days earlier when he passed her outside the post office, clutching a parcel and walking too quickly. She stood there for a moment in the cool wind, the button balanced on her palm like a scale. The question was not whether Leonard Reed had used the path. He had. The question was whether he had followed the man, or met him there, or, worse. As she walked back toward the house, she noticed something else. A small stone statue by the edge of the flower bed, a fox with a chipped ear, had been recently moved. The grass beneath it was paler, flattened. Someone had placed something beneath it, then retrieved it. Not papers. Too thick. A small object, perhaps wrapped, perhaps discarded. Miss Marple pressed her lips together. Back in the village, Inspector Bullfinch had decided to convene an information meeting at the public hall. It was not quite an inquest, nor quite a lecture, but he hoped that if enough people were assembled under one roof, someone might panic or remember something useful. Miss Marple arrived 10 minutes early and sat near the back, knitting calmly as the room filled with villagers. The atmosphere was electric, some hoping to hear scandal, others silently terrified it might brush too close to home. Bullfinch cleared his throat and began. The man has not been identified. We know only that he wore European shoes, had no luggage, and bore a scar consistent with wartime injury. He had no connections to anyone in the village. "That you know of," muttered Mrs. Price Ridley, "and no sign of robbery or personal items was found, except the Belgian chocolate wrapper," said Miss Marple quietly. All heads turned. Bullfinch blinked. "I beg your pardon," Miss Marple continued knitting. "Belgian chocolate, orange sugar sticks, quite rare in this part of the country, yet the wrapper was in the waste bin of the vicarage guest room." The inspector frowned. "And how did you come by that detail?" "Oh," said Miss Marple, her eyes twinkling faintly. "I always check the bins when I visit. People never hide things in plain sight." She left the matter there, but the effect was marked. Leonard Reed, seated 3 rows ahead, had gone visibly pale. Miss Marple observed him quietly, her fingers never pausing over the yarn. There was a story here, still concealed, but coming into view. Someone had known the stranger. Perhaps not many, but at least one. And that one had not counted on Miss Marple's eyes or her memory. Chapter 5. A Conversation in the Churchyard. The next day brought with it a blanket of thick mist, curling around hedgerows and lamp-posts like a veil drawn over the village. Lydney St. Mary, already uneasy, now felt positively shrouded. Though chimneys puffed out long plumes of smoke, and figures moved like ghosts along the lanes. Miss Marple, however, was not deterred by a little fog. Quite the contrary. She found people more prone to honesty when the weather blurred their outlines. After her morning tea, she made her way up to the churchyard, a wicker basket in hand, filled with cuttings from her garden, and a small parcel of sponge cake for old Mr. Hill, the gravedigger, who had been suffering from rheumatism since Candlemas. She found him tending to the north wall of the cemetery, where the earth rose unevenly, and the headstones stood at shy angles like forgotten schoolchildren. "Miss Marple," he greeted, tipping his flat cap. "That's kind, that is. Bit of cake'll put life back in my knees." She smiled. "The village has been in quite a state, Mr. Hill. I thought a little kindness might ease the air." He gave a gruff chuckle and sat on the edge of a low stone. I hear they still don't know who the poor man was, he said, glancing about. No name, no past. Bit like planting a seed without knowing what flower it'll be. Miss Marple sat beside him on a flat rock, smoothing her skirt. You see much from here, I imagine. Oh, yes, he said, nodding. More than folk reckon. Quiet eyes catch loud deeds, my dad used to say. And did your quiet eyes happen to see anything odd this past week? Perhaps someone cutting across from the vicarage late at night? Or a stranger taking the path by the hedge? Mr. Hill scratched his chin. Now you mention it. I did see young Mr. Reed one evening. Tuesday, I think it was. Bit after 9. Came from the side path. Quick steps like he didn't want to be seen. Didn't notice me, mind. I was trimming ivy. Carrying anything? Mr. Hill thought. Couldn't say, but his coat looked odd. Bulky under one arm, like he was clutching something close. Miss Marple nodded. And has he been about since? Twice. Looked twitchy. Like a lad with a secret too big for his boots. That, Miss Marple thought, sounded about right. She thanked Mr. Hill, promised more sponge cake next week, and made her way through the mist toward the rectory lane. As she walked, her thoughts turned like cogs in a well-oiled clock. Leonard Reed had clearly met the man. The parcel, the missing coat button, the evasiveness, these were not signs of an innocent bystander. But guilt of what exactly? She needed to know more about Leonard, and as was often the case in Lydney St. Mary, knowledge lived with Miss Hartnell. She found her old friend in the drawing-room of a well-kept cottage, busily clipping recipes from a stack of faded magazines. "Oh, Jane, you've come just in time. I'm trying to decide between apricot syllabub or the pineapple fool for the harvest luncheon. What do you think?" "Both sound dreadful," Miss Marple said warmly. "But that's never stopped the vicar from pretending to enjoy them." Miss Hartnell laughed. "True enough." "I came," Miss Marple continued gently, "to ask about Leonard Reed." Miss Hartnell pursed her lips. A broody young man, not the sort I'd want reading scripture to my grandchildren. But Edith always said he was earnest, and the bishop sponsored him for theological college. Bit of a rough background, though. Oh? Orphaned young, raised by an aunt in Cornwall, came to Lydney St. Mary 5 years ago as a gardener's apprentice. Would you believe it? Quite the rise. But I never liked how he looked at people, as though deciding whether they were worth the trouble. And was he close to anyone in the village? Miss Hartnell considered. Only to that new widow, I think. What's her name? Miss Elspeth Kane. Moved here from London last year. Quiet type. Always has gloves on, even in summer. Miss Marple gave a small hum. She knew the name. Elspeth Kane lived on Lavender Row, just 2 cottages from the lane's end. A widow of indeterminate means and polite reserve. She rarely attended social gatherings, but was a generous donor to church raffles, and known for walking her spaniel precisely at 6 each evening. Was it possible Leonard had confided in her, or more than that? Miss Marple made a note to visit Miss Kane later that day, but before she could, a new ripple passed through the village. Constable Reeves appeared at her door just after noon, face flushed from exertion and nerves. "Miss Marple," he said breathlessly, "they've found something, a suitcase, hidden in the gardener's shed behind the vicarage." She blinked. "And? It's locked. But inside, through a tear in the lining, we saw a document, Foreign, but with English. Translation, passport page, the man's name, Karl Brenwald. Swiss, apparently. Arrived in England 6 days ago. And what else? Reeves lowered his voice. There's also a revolver, unloaded, and a photograph of a much younger Leonard Reed, smiling, with Brenwald beside him. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a brief moment. I see, she murmured. It explained more than it solved. Leonard had known the man, deeply perhaps. But why hide the suitcase? Why not come forward, unless the truth, whatever it was, threatened more than just Leonard's reputation? Perhaps it threatened his entire future, or someone else's, and Miss Marple, standing by the hearth with her lace gloves in one hand, now knew where she must go next, to Miss Kane's cottage on Lavender Row, because gloves in summer were almost always hiding something. Chapter 6. Gloves on Lavender Row. Lavender Row was a quiet little curve of houses at the edge of the village. Prim, floral, and well suited to names like Primrose Cottage and the Laurels. It was a part of Lydney St. Mary that seemed purpose-built for privacy. People who lived there did not hang laundry at the front or loiter on stoops. They went about their business with the practised discretion of those who had learned long ago to draw their curtains before dusk. Miss Marple walked there, slowly, not because of her age, though her steps were indeed careful, but because haste clouded perception. She took note of everything. The lack of weeds on Miss Kane's pathway, the polished brass knocker shaped like a lion's head, the faint scent of lavender oil from an open upstairs window. She rang the bell and waited. The door opened precisely. 10 seconds later, as if Miss Kane had been standing just inside, watching. Miss Marple, the younger woman said, "This is unexpected." Elspeth Kane was in her late 30s, fashionably pale, with ash-blonde hair pulled into a tight chignon. She wore a high-necked blouse, and as usual thin beige gloves, unseasonal for the early spring warmth. "I do apologize," Miss Marple said warmly. "I was out for a walk and thought I might check on you. These last few days have been so unsettling." Miss Kane hesitated, then stepped aside. "Of course. Please, come in." The sitting room was as Miss Marple expected, tasteful, sparse, and immaculately clean. There were no photographs on the mantel, no books out of place, and not a single thread out of line on the embroidered cushions. This was a room where no one ever forgot to compose themselves. "I hope you don't mind my saying," Miss Marple began, "but you've struck me, Miss Kane, as someone who notices things. And I rather thought you might have noticed something useful about the stranger. I'm not sure I understand. Oh, you know how village gossip can be. Faces seen, things half remembered. Even the smallest recollection may help. Did you ever see the man before he died?" Miss Kane gave a delicate shake of the head. "No, not to my knowledge." "But perhaps you knew Leonard Reed, spoke to him often." Elspeth's expression didn't change, but her fingers twitched, ever so slightly on the armrest. "We've spoken," she replied. "In passing." Miss Marple studied her. "Only in passing." Another pause. The faintest breath of hesitation. "We had coffee once or twice. He asked for advice about theological schools, of course," Miss Marple said with a polite nod. "He's a thoughtful young man, if a bit troubled." Elspeth Kane offered a careful smile. "Yes, I suppose that's accurate." Would it be fair to say, Miss Marple continued, that you and he were close?" A beat too long passed before Miss Kane answered, "Not especially. I don't involve myself in village affairs." Miss Marple gave no sign of pressing, though her gaze drifted to the gloves. They were soft kid leather, not work gloves, and there was no logical reason for them indoors. "Forgive my curiosity," she said lightly, "but I've always been fascinated by gloves. Such useful things. I knew a woman once who wore hers, even to bed. Said they made her hands feel less real, less like hers." Miss Kane blinked. "That sounds odd." "Oh, yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But she was quite an odd woman, though not nearly as odd as the one who wore gloves after falling down her garden steps. Dislocated her wrist and bruised the skin terribly. She hid it for weeks, said it made her look fragile." Miss Kane gave a tight laugh. "Well, some of us bruise easily, Miss Marple. I imagine that's true." There was silence then. Long, soft, almost companionable. Outside, a thrush sang briefly before fluttering off the fence. Miss Marple leaned back. "Elspeth, I know Leonard Reed was more than a passing acquaintance. I believe he trusted you. Perhaps still does. But there's something weighing on him, and I think you know what it is." Miss Kane stiffened. Her jaw tensed, then relaxed again. "He was frightened," she said at last. "That man, Carl, he came here looking for him, not just by chance. He found Leonard first, or rather, Leonard found him. They met the night before he died, in the lane." Miss Marple nodded, saying nothing. "They had history," Miss Kane went on, almost mechanically. "Something from before Leonard came here. Something serious. Leonard never told me everything, just enough to know that Carl had power over him, power to destroy his reputation, his future. Did Leonard kill him?" Miss Kane's eyes widened. No, I swear! Leonard wouldn't. He isn't capable." "But he did hide the suitcase." Ichjaku didn't reply. Miss Marple studied her gloved hands, folded now in her lap like paper birds. "Miss Kane," she said gently, "may I see your left hand?" Elspeth froze. "Why?" "You're not wearing the gloves to be fashionable. You're wearing them to hide an injury. You've winced 3 times since I entered the room. Once lifting the teapot, once adjusting your sleeve, and once when you picked up your napkin." The room was silent. Elspeth slowly peeled the glove from her left hand. Bruises, fresh ones circling the wrist like a cuff. Discoloration up the thumb. Defensive bruises. "I found him," she whispered, "after Leonard had run. I don't know why. I think he panicked. I saw Carl's body in the garden. I tried to help him, but he was already dead." "And the bruises?" "I slipped on the flagstone," she said, "fell on my wrist trying to drag him away from the path. I didn't want the police to think Leonard did it. I didn't want him ruined." Miss Marple reached across and took her hand, gentle as a leaf landing on water. "Thank you, my dear. That mustn't have been easy." "I didn't kill him," Elspeth said again. Miss Marple's expression didn't change. "No," she said softly, "but I think I've just realized who did." Chapter 7. Tea at the Vicarage, and an Omission. Miss Marple did not rush. She left Lavender Row with the same calm steps she had taken upon arrival, though her mind was anything but quiet. The bruise on Elspeth Kane's wrist had told her much, But more importantly, so had the things the young woman had not said. The scene was becoming clearer now, though the figure at its centre remained just beyond reach. By the time the church bells rang 4, Miss Marple was seated once again in the vicarage parlour, sipping tea with Edith Upwater and pretending to admire a particularly poor arrangement of dried flowers. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "you've been under such strain. All this attention, the terrible invasion of your garden. Have you been sleeping?" "Hardly," Edith replied, her eyes shadowed. "Every creak makes me jump. And poor Lionel, he tries to carry on, but it's obvious he's shaken. The bishops even mentioned a temporary retreat, just until things quiet down." Miss Marple gave a sympathetic nod, her gaze wandering to the framed photo on the mantel, a black-and-white image of the vicar and his wife on their wedding day. Beside it, slightly obscured, was a newer frame, Leonard Reed with a group of Sunday school children, one arm raised in gesture, the other bent strangely at the elbow, as if something had been edited out of the pose. "Edith," she said, adjusting her spectacles, "may I ask a small, possibly silly question? The morning the man appeared, the stranger, do you remember if Leonard was at the vicarage before or after the visit?" Edith blinked. "After. He came in perhaps 15 minutes later. Said he'd overslept." "Why?" Miss Marple smiled. "Just tidying up details. I find the order of things matters very much, don't you?" The vicar's study door opened then, and Reverend Upwater entered, his expression wary. He nodded to Miss Marple and sat beside his wife, smoothing his trousers. "Is there any progress?" he asked. "It's so unspeakably awkward to host death and scandal on sacred ground." "I believe there has been progress." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "but I think much of it has not yet been recognized for what it is." Reverend Upwater looked puzzled. "I'm afraid I don't follow." "It's all very odd, you know," Miss Marple continued, her tone light, "that a man should appear in the garden and then die there, so quietly, so quickly, and with no apparent reason. No struggle was heard, no cry, just silence. Don't you find that strange?" The vicar cleared his throat. "I assumed, perhaps wrongly, that the man was attacked elsewhere and dragged into the garden." "Dragged," Miss Marple repeated, "yet no trail of blood, no disturbed soil, and only one glove on the body. The other, found beneath the holly bush, curled like a fallen leaf." Edith's eyes widened. "I didn't know that." Miss Marple turned to her. "You wouldn't, dear. The constable only noticed it yesterday. You see, if a man falls forward while struggling, it's unusual for his glove to come off entirely, unless someone pulled it, or unless it was already removed." Reverend Upwater looked uncomfortable. "I don't quite understand what you're implying. Only that the man was most likely facing someone he trusted, or at least recognized. No signs of robbery, but perhaps a confrontation, a moment of pause." Miss Marple stood and crossed to the window. Outside, the garden stretched quietly, the holly bush now trimmed and neat again. The statue of the fox had been righted. "I once knew a curate," she said, "who led a double life in Belgium. Seemed charming, spoke perfect French. But he embezzled money from his parish to pay off a scandal, an affair from before the war. He was discovered when a letter surfaced from a Carl B. in Lausanne." The silence in the room thickened. Miss Marple turned. "Leonard Reed had a past. We all do. But the question isn't what he was. It's what Carl Brenwald came to do. Not to blackmail. No, I believe he came to help. That photograph of the two of them together? A kind gesture. A reminder. And the gun in the suitcase, unloaded, was for protection, not aggression. The vicar's hands tightened over his knees. Miss Marple, if you're suggesting, I'm suggesting, she said gently, that someone else intercepted Carl before he could speak with Leonard, someone who overheard enough to feel threatened, someone with a great deal to lose if Leonard's past became public knowledge. After all, theological colleges don't take kindly to scandal, especially those sponsored by respected figures. Edith gave a sharp breath. You can't mean Lionel? Miss Marple looked at the vicar. The bishop, you said, has been considering your elevation. An archdeaconry, perhaps. But how would it look if your protégé, your personal project, was tied to a man like Brenwald? What if it raised questions about your own judgment? The room was very still. Reverend Upwater's mouth opened, then closed. He looked toward the fire grate. I didn't mean to kill him, he said finally. I asked to meet him, just to speak, to understand how much he knew. He recognized me, I think. He said something like, You're the one who sent the letters. I panicked. Edith's hands flew to her mouth. Lionel, I thought if I scared him off, sent him away. But he got angry, grabbed my wrist. The spade was beside, the holly bush. It was only a moment, just one. Miss Marple said nothing for several seconds. Then she walked to the side table and poured another cup of tea. I believe, she said quietly, you should write your resignation to the bishop and tell Inspector Bullfinch everything. Will he arrest me? The vicar asked in a small voice. Miss Marple looked at him, her expression unreadable. That depends, she said, on whether he believes you killed out of fear or out of malice. She left the vicarage a moment later, the mist having lifted and the sun just beginning. To return, the garden gate creaked closed behind her. Chapter 8. The Bishop's Letter By. Saturday morning, the air in Lydney St. Mary had turned brisk and oddly expectant, like the breath held before the final line of a hymn. The mist had vanished completely, leaving the lanes sharp and visible beneath a bright sun. But within the quiet walls of the vicarage, clouds remained. Inspector Bullfinch arrived before 10, summoned not by telephone, but by a brief, handwritten note slipped under the station door, composed in the careful looping script of Reverend Lionel Upwater. Miss Marple, having taken the liberty of arranging the inspector's breakfast at the village tea-room, was already seated with her cup of Darjeeling and a warm currant bun when the man himself entered, coat flapping, boots still dusty from the garden path. "Well, then," Bullfinch said, lowering himself heavily onto the bench opposite her, I take it you've come to hear what I've heard." She smiled politely. "Only if you wish to tell me." He glanced around, as if checking for eavesdroppers, and lowered his voice. The vicar confessed, said he struck the fellow during a confrontation, claims it wasn't premeditated. The coroner will want to examine the angle of the wound, of course, but it's plausible, said the man lunged. "Old story." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "And you believe him?" Bullfinch scratched his chin. "I believe he's afraid, but I also believe there's more. You think so too, don't you?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Perhaps. What interests me most is that he used the word panic, and that he claimed to have acted alone. But one doesn't hide a suitcase after an act of panic. One doesn't carry it from the lane, unlock a shed and cover it behind crates unless one has help." The inspector grunted. "Miss Kane?" "She admitted to finding the body after Leonard ran away. I believe her. But the suitcase was hidden well before that. And Leonard, frightened, confused, wouldn't have thought of such details." Bullfinch exhaled. "You believe the vicar had planned something?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, "that Reverend Upwater knew Carl Brenwald's visit posed a danger, not merely to Leonard Reed's future, but to his own." "And you think he lured him there?" Miss Marple picked up her bun, then paused. "I think he wrote the man some weeks earlier. A letter perhaps in Leonard's name, urging him to come. He likely intercepted Carl before Leonard knew he'd arrived. He must have meant only to persuade him to leave quietly. But Carl recognized him. Things escalated." Bullfinch leaned back. "That makes Upwater's story more calculated than he's admitted. Still, if it's true, Carl had no legal status here. Oh, I'm sure it will all be managed discreetly," Miss Marple said, "but that still leaves one piece unresolved." "Which?" She set down her teacup. "The bishop." Bullfinch blinked. "What does he have to do with it?" "Quite a lot, I think." At that moment, a telegram boy burst into the tea-room. He scanned the tables until his eyes landed on Miss Marple. "For you, miss. Special delivery." She unfolded the paper. "From Bishop C. Mortimer to Miss Jane Marple, Lydney St. Mary. Deeply disturbed by Reverend Upwater's confession. Had no knowledge of correspondence with Swiss National. Please meet me at Vicarage noon." Miss Marple handed the slip across the table. Bullfinch read it, then frowned. "So the bishop denies involvement." "Of course he does," she replied. But the letter Carl received must have appeared official enough to prompt travel. And Carl wasn't a fool. He wouldn't have come all the way from Zurich for a vague summons. It must have been carefully written. "And forged," Bullfinch said, nodding. "Perhaps with church letterhead." "Precisely." At noon, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage, where the bishop had just concluded his private meeting with the Reverend. The clergyman's face was ashen, his resignation already signed. Bishop Mortimer, a tall man with severe eyebrows and a soft voice, greeted her in the drawing-room. "Miss Marple," he said, offering his hand, "I must confess I had no idea of the depth of what has transpired here. I've known Lionel for 20 years. This is unthinkable." "It is tragic," Miss Marple agreed, "but not, I'm afraid, entirely unpredictable." The bishop's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Glanced at the hearth, where Edith Upwater sat silently knitting. "There was ambition," Miss Marple said softly. "A great deal of it, bound up with appearances. I think Reverend Upwater saw Leonard Reed as his project, a brilliant redemption story, from orphan to clergyman. But such narratives are delicate. A single foreign acquaintance, a whisper of scandal, and the whole structure collapses." The bishop's lips pressed into a tight line. "He should have told me." "He was ashamed," Miss Marple replied. "But more than that, I believe he felt cornered. Once Carl arrived, he realized there was no going back. The lie had grown, too large, The bishop exhaled. "And now the lie has ruined them all." Miss Marple gave a faint nod. "Not all. Leonard is young. If the full truth is known, his part in it minimal, confused, I believe he may yet find a different path." And Elspeth Kane, a woman of strong nerves and loyal instincts, Miss Marple said, "she'll weather this storm. As for the rest of the village, well, gossip will flare for a week or two, and then it will all be stitched back into the fabric of memory, quietly, politely forgotten." She stood, smoothing her gloves. "But I do hope, Bishop, that in your next appointment you encourage your clergy to value honesty above reputation. It saves a great deal of gardening." The bishop smiled despite himself. "You've a gift, Miss Marple." She tilted her head. "No, my lord, merely a habit of listening." As she stepped out into the sunlight, the first lilacs were beginning to bloom along the lane, their scent soft and steady in the breeze. A bird called from the church tower. The gate to the vicarage clicked gently behind her, and Miss Marple, with a satisfied sigh, made her way home to her teapot and her knitting, where she could once more turn her attention to the more predictable threads of wool and human nature. Chapter 9. Truth's Best. Left in the garden, despite the murder, despite the suitcase and resignation, despite the uncomfortable brush with scandal, Lydney St. Mary resumed its rhythms with almost suspicious ease. By Monday, the bakery's butter shortage was the most discussed tragedy, and the post office queue had returned to its usual muttered complaints about parcel delays and the price of international stamps. But beneath the surface of every polite nod and warm handshake, something had shifted. Miss Marple felt it not in words, but in silences, longer pauses before greetings, shorter eye contact, and that peculiar hush that descends whenever a certain subject threatens to rise. She was in the back garden of her cottage that morning, carefully deadheading the dahlias, when she was visited by Leonard Reed. He arrived awkwardly, hands deep in his coat pockets, the brim of his hat shading his eyes. It was the first time he had come to her directly since Karl Brenwald's death. "Miss Marple," he said quietly. She looked up. "Mr. Reed, come sit. The morning sun is rather forgiving." He hesitated, then sat on the stone bench near the gooseberry bush. "I wanted to thank you," he began. "That's kind," she said, "though I've done very little. You've done everything. If you hadn't spoken to Elspeth, if you hadn't understood before the police did, I don't know where I'd be now." She smiled, not unkindly. "Sometimes understanding isn't about solving. It's about allowing people the space to tell the truth." He nodded. "I never meant for any of this. Karl, he wasn't a threat. He'd come to make peace, I think. He was doing well in Zurich. Said he'd found work, stability. He wanted to see if I needed help. But Reverend Upwater believed otherwise." Leonard's jaw tightened. "He overheard me talking about Karl once, months ago, after a late supper. I didn't say much, just that we'd been close, that we'd known each other before I turned to faith. He didn't say anything at the time, but he changed toward me, subtly. Less trust, fewer responsibilities." Miss Marple poured him a glass of lemonade from a tray nearby. "When Karl came," she said, "you were afraid." "Yes, not of him, of everything else, that someone might think I'd lied to get where I was, that I'd deceived the church. And truthfully, I had. Not in facts, but in omission. Miss Marple considered this. Omission, she said softly, can be a type of protection, but when used by others, it can become a weapon. He looked away. He asked me to leave quietly. The vicar. He said if I had any respect for my future, I'd walk away. I think he planned to meet Carl afterward. Perhaps he thought he could pay him off or frighten him. I don't think he expected a confrontation. Miss Marple's eyes were distant. Men rarely do. They assume the world can be put right with a stern word and a tidy solution. Leonard rubbed his hands together. I didn't go far. I watched from the trees. When I saw Carl fall, I couldn't process it. I didn't go to him. I ran, like a coward. Like a young man overwhelmed by something too large to carry alone, Miss Marple said gently. There is a difference. He glanced at her. Do you think I should leave Lydney? Miss Marple paused. That, she said slowly, depends on whether you wish to continue being someone else, or if you're ready to become yourself, now that the past no longer chases you. Leonard, Reed sat in silence. Then, with a quiet breath, he stood. Thank you, he said again, for seeing me when I wasn't sure who I was anymore. She watched him walk down the garden path, shoulders straighter, steps heavier, but no longer directionless. Later that day, she took her usual seat at the window overlooking the green. The news of the vicar's formal resignation had now made. The morning messenger, tucked discreetly between news of a rare meteor shower and the recipe column. Miss Marple noted that the article referred to a health-related leave, and she allowed that discretion had, perhaps, been wisely chosen. Across the road, Elspeth Kane passed by on her walk, spaniel at her side. She wore no gloves, just a soft linen jacket, her bruised hand held plainly by the leash. She caught sight of Miss Marple, and the older woman gave her a small nod. Elspeth returned it. Some truths, Miss Marple thought, need only be acknowledged once. That evening, at the parish council meeting, there were no references to the murder or the resignation. Instead, a discussion unfolded about repairing the vestry roof, replacing the hymnals, and possibly inviting a new choirmaster from East Davington. Miss Marple spoke only once, to suggest lavender under the west windows to deter the bees. The word, Donc, proposal passed unanimously. As the meeting drew to a close, Constable Reeves lingered by the tea-table. So it's finished, then? Miss Marple looked up from her biscuit. No, my dear, it's simply settled. He frowned. What's the difference? She smiled. A settled story may not have all the facts, but it has found its place in people's minds. That's all justice really is sometimes. A kind of peace, even if imperfect. He chewed on that. Still, he muttered, odd place to die. In a garden with holly and fox statues. Miss Marple nodded. Gardens reveal more than we expect. Things grow there, and not just plants. Secrets, guilt, and occasionally, truth. She folded her napkin and rose. And as she walked home beneath the faint stars and the soft smell of damp grass, the village once more felt like itself, quiet, contained, and watchful, as it always had been. Chapter 10. The Quiet. Beneath the ivy 2 weeks had passed since the affair in the vicarage garden had been laid to rest, and already the village had done what villages do best. Folded the memory into its patchwork of cautionary tales, whispered conversations, and politely unfinished sentences. The holly bush had grown a little, and the small stone fox statue now wore a modest veil of ivy, as if modesty itself had crept into the soil. Miss Marple was in her sitting room one breezy afternoon when she received a letter. Creamy paper, ink slightly smudged. It was from Elspeth Kane. Dear Miss Marple, Leonard has accepted a position at a school in Devon. Not in the church, at least not for now. He says he wants to learn how to be honest before he ever tries to lead others again. I told him it was the first sensible thing he's said in months. I'm staying in Lydney St. Mary. I think I've spent enough of my life running. I wanted you to know that I'm well, and that I haven't forgotten what you did. For both of us, yours sincerely. Elspeth Kane. Miss Marple set the letter down with a quiet exhale. Outside, the postman tipped his cap to a robin. Later that day, Inspector Bullfinch came for tea. He arrived stiffly, as always, but brought with him a small parcel of cinnamon biscuits from his sister in Much Biddleton, which Miss Marple accepted with warm gratitude. So it's done, he said, sipping tea by the fireplace. The bishop's office confirmed Upwater's resignation. The church, unsurprisingly, declined to press charges. They've called it a moral failing. Very ecclesiastical way of putting it. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Moral failings are often much harder to prosecute than criminal ones. The inspector frowned. There's still something that doesn't sit quite right. Oh, I understand why Upwater panicked. I even understand the attempted cover-up. But what I don't understand is, why the glove? Miss Marple looked at him gently. It was not Upwater who removed the glove. Bullfinch's brow furrowed. What? Think of the scene. Carl Brenwald lying face down, one glove missing, no defensive wounds, no blood on Leonard's hands, and most importantly, no struggle witnessed by anyone nearby, despite the garden being so central. She poured herself more tea. Upwater didn't lure Carl there to scare him. He lured him to listen, to see if Carl might be persuaded to keep Leonard's past a secret. But the moment turned. Carl likely said something, perhaps threatened to expose Upwater's letters or his manipulation of church sponsorship. Something that felt too risky. And then Upwater killed him. No, Miss Marple said simply. Upwater confronted Carl. They argued, and someone overheard it. Someone who had more to lose than even the Reverend. Bullfinch stared. Elspeth Kane, Miss Marple said, her voice a whisper over porcelain. She was not just Leonard's confidant. She had a relationship with Carl once. Brief, distant, but meaningful. Before he ever knew Leonard. Before the war. A chance meeting in Zurich during her student days. When she realized who he was, the man from Leonard's past, she must have felt her world narrowing. She told me she found the body after Leonard fled. She lied, Miss Marple said gently. She didn't find it. She created it. She was in the garden already, perhaps following Leonard, perhaps out for air. She saw the confrontation, and she saw an opportunity. Bullfinch leaned forward, but the bruises on her wrist, she said she fell. She did, said Miss Marple, but not trying to help the man, trying to drag him deeper into the hedge, to make it look like he had been surprised. She removed his glove. to suggest a struggle, to confuse the timeline. She killed him. No, Miss Marple said softly, but she ensured the death became a murder. She turned panic into deception. And that, Inspector, is what buried the truth deeper than any spade. Bullfinch rubbed his chin. You have no proof. No, Miss Marple agreed, but she will not leave the village. She will tend her roses. She will walk her spaniel. She will do penance in the only way that makes sense to her, and that, too, is a kind of justice. They sat in silence for a while. Then the inspector stood, offered her his hand, and gave a rare, quiet nod of respect. Outside, dusk fell over Lydney St. Mary, laying down shadows like folded linen. The vicarage gate no longer squeaked. The holly bush had been trimmed. A new curate had been appointed, younger, cheerful, and unburdened by scandal, and Miss Marple, seated by her lace-draped window, resumed her knitting. The needles clicked softly, steadily, as the village turned another page in its long, curious book of secrets. And in the heart of the garden, beneath the ivy and the silence, the truth slept gently, no longer dangerous, only remembered. Epilogue. The garden remembers. Spring deepened in Lydney St. Mary. The skies turned a warmer blue, and lambs appeared in the fields beyond the hedgerows. The village seemed to stretch its limbs after a long winter, not the one of weather, but of silence and scandal, murmured regrets, and the slow recalibration of reputations. It was on a Thursday morning, nearly a month after the events at the vicarage, that Miss Marple found herself once again walking along the side path that led past the garden's edge. The holly bush, site of so much recent speculation, had begun to sprout tender new leaves, green and soft, as though unaware of the grim memory tied to its roots. She paused there, not out of morbidity, but out of something more contemplative. Time had passed, and with it the worst of the gossip had faded. Yet the earth never truly forgets. Not murder, not guilt, not human frailty. Edith Upwater had left the vicarage quietly a week after her husband's resignation. She went to stay with a cousin in the Cotswolds, citing the need for spiritual recuperation. No one questioned it. No one needed to. There had been no formal farewell, no church tea in her honour, only a bouquet left by Miss Hartnell on the doorstep, and a note that read, "You were always kind to the choir boys." Reverend Lionel Upwater's future was less certain. The church had accepted his resignation without scandal, the matter framed publicly as exhaustion and ill health. Privately, Miss Marple had heard from Bishop Mortimer himself that Upwater was being relocated to a small retreat in the north, where he would serve in solitude and contemplation. A gentler exile, Miss Marple did not think ill of him. Weakness came in many forms, and though he had committed no direct murder, his fear had steered the course of more than one life. For that, he would have a long time to reflect. Leonard Reed had indeed taken a teaching position in Devon. He sent postcards to Elspeth Kane at first, then began to write longer letters, more personal, more candid. In one, which Elspeth had shared over tea, he wrote, "I think the greatest punishment for me is realizing I wasn't honest with myself. The faith I claimed was borrowed. Now, I am trying to find one of my own, not given by mentors, not taken from regret, but something that grows, like a thing planted in proper soil. Miss Marple found that metaphor pleasing. Elspeth Kane had not left Lydney, though many expected she would. She remained in her cottage on Lavender Row, and though she no longer wore gloves, she remained the same in many ways, precise, independent, and observant. But there was a slight change in her manner now, a softening of the voice, a longer pause before speaking, as though she were measuring not just her words, but her place in the world. One afternoon, as they sat in Miss Marple's garden sipping nettle tea, Elspeth remarked, "I sometimes wonder what might have happened had Carl lived. Had he stayed, spoken?" Miss Marple had regarded her evenly. "I think he would have forgiven." Elspeth looked down. "That's what terrifies me." It was not a confession, not directly, but it was enough. The village itself, as always, healed through rhythm. The spring fete had been announced with the usual bunting, and Mrs. Price Ridley was already assembling volunteers for the sponge cake competition. The parish council had installed new benches outside the church, and no one mentioned why one of the old ones had been quietly removed and burned. And though no one said it aloud, there was an unspoken agreement that some questions, like where Carl Brenwald had spent the night before his death, would remain unanswered. Inspector Bullfinch returned to Much Biddleton, mildly irritated that no formal charges had been laid, but secretly relieved to have escaped the village's suffocating politeness. Constable Reeves continued to make his rounds, often slower now, more thoughtful. He had taken to jotting notes about unusual behaviour, which he never submitted, just for himself, he said, to practice seeing what Miss Marple sees. As for Miss Marple herself, she resumed her usual quiet routines. Tea in the garden, Thursdays at the library, and evenings by the fire with her needles and wool. Yet something in her had shifted too, not her clarity or sense of justice, but her understanding of how deep even the quietest souls could bury their secrets. She reflected often on the truth of the matter. The murder had been sudden, yes, but the motive had grown slowly, like ivy over stone. Not just fear, not just ambition, but the desperate human need to control how others see us, to manage memory before it is made. Carl Brenwald had threatened no one, not really, but his presence had reminded everyone that the past was never quite buried, and in a village that thrived on presentation, on clean garden paths and trimmed hedges, there was little room for messier truths. Miss Marple stood once more by the garden gate, now painted a new shade of green. She watched the children from the school run by, laughing, untethered by the weight of things buried. She remembered a verse, something her father had once said after a funeral when she was still a girl. There,